Okay, everyone, it is now 4:15, and so I resume the hearing. We are on question 3.7, and I intend now to go to the Council's final reply to what we have heard before moving on to 3.8. Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. I'll be very brief. I think the overarching theme really from the contributions around the table is that from the vast majority of what you've heard relates really to the application of the methodology rather than the methodology itself. And that applies with particular reference to the allocated sites that can be considered at phase 2. So the fundamental point is we don't hear anything at the session this afternoon which is suggesting a fundamental methodological flaw as opposed to differences in judgment about how that methodology has been applied in individual cases.
I'm not sure that's entirely right, but I've heard what I've heard.
Yes, we accept that Mr. Cursier, for example, has raised points about methodology, but a number of contributors, including Mr. Smith, I think Mr. Johnson in the end, and Mr. Butler too, were prepared to say that a lot of this is related to the application of the methodology rather than the methodology itself. And to that extent we say that really largely the issues that have been raised are of application in individual cases. But as far as Mr. Cursier's points are concerned, really his complaint is that the green belt wasn't properly assessed at the outset, and he goes back to his figure 7 point. I don't want to labour this, but again, Mr. Cursier is looking at a figure that was prepared for strategic purposes as the end point of a layering of constraints, which is entirely appropriate at that level of assessment. And the assessment proceeded in all cases to more localised work, including the historic impact assessment work, which has been welcomed by Historic England. The principles inherent within Figure 7 were reflected in the site selection process. I ask you to bear in mind, sir, that the call for site process has resulted in the Council considering over 1,000 different parcels of land. And one must be realistic when one is looking at the release of sites in the green belt or the release of sites generally across planned period. Of the fundamental aspect in needing a willing landowner. So the suggestion that the Council needed to move beyond looking at 1,000 parcels of land through the site selection process to some field by field or parcel by parcel review of the entire green belt beyond the approach that it took at a strategic level, we say is not right. As for alternatives, we say, we've mentioned this before, the sustainability appraisal does look to the extent that was appropriate at alternatives in Appendix I, which looked at the individual sites. And the sites aspect of the sustainability appraisal looked at all reasonable alternatives that had come through the first stage of the SLA process, plus the strategic sites. And the assessment of those sites has been evidenced through an audit trail, which appears at Appendix K to the sustainability appraisal. We say that approach was entirely sufficient in this case. As for the point you raised, sir, about, I think it was particularly related to ST7 and ST8, I can ask Ms Kennedy to, Ms Sheldon, sorry, to explain the answer to your question about moving straight to green belt considerations.
Thank you. So in considering the land that needed to be released from the green belt in line with the exceptional circumstances, we looked to the principles of the Heritage Topic Paper and the Heritage Impact Appraisals to inform what those boundaries should be. With specific reference to ST7 and ST8, in both those cases, it was identified that it was important, in according with those principles, that separation was required to ensure that the original districts and that those of the new district retained separate identities. At that time, it was recognised that there were a variety of different mechanisms that could be employed to maintain that separation. However, as the principle was important to maintaining the historic setting of the city, that was identified as a robust mechanism to be able to do this.
Okay, in which case then I will move to question 3.8. Have the greenbelt boundaries as proposed to be altered been considered having regard to their intended permanence in the long term? Are they capable of enduring beyond the planned period?
Sir, it struck us when looking at 3.8 and 3.9, just wanted to check with you. We'd understood these questions to relate to the, essentially the proposed allocations.
It is, yeah.
Right, okay. And
yes, I think we've done the inner and outer boundaries in those regards.
yes, I mean, I think, sir, bearing in mind that, as you've indicated, we'll be returning to this
And
these sites at stage 2.
Apologies, yes. Just to reassure Mr. Lane, we will be looking at those in relation to villages as well.
Yes.
But for specific reasons as part of phase 2.
Yes. I mean, I think, sir, with that in mind, we'd seen 3.8 and 3.9 as being capable, hopefully, of being addressed briefly, knowing that you'd be returning to these sites at stage 2. But in short, 3.8, our response says, yes, the proposed boundary for each site allocated for removal has been assessed in terms of openness and permanence, using the same approach as applied to the inner and outer boundaries, albeit addressed more briefly in Annex 5, because under each of the entries, under detailed boundary issues, that is where permanence has been taken into account. And we've sought to ensure that defensible boundaries contribute to delivering a permanent green belt in that sense under each of those Annex 5 entries.
So, in short, is it the same methodology that's been used?
Yes, sir.
As for the inner and outer boundaries, I mean.
Yes, sir. And I think, sir, in a sense, without wanting to preempt 3.9, I think that the answer is essentially the same, in the sense that 3.9 appears to follow on from 3.8. The justification is set out in each of the entries in what we assume to be Annex 5 in the question, not Annex 6.
I think that we can probably take 3.8, 3.9 and indeed 3.10 together.
Yes, very well, sir. If we do that, then yes, assuming that 3.9 relates to Annex 5, we have set out the alterations in each of the individual entries, and we've done that by identifying the exceptional circumstances, first of all. We've then gone through the individual Greenbelt purposes, as we've discussed already. And we have identified the detailed boundary considerations, and we've done that on a site-by-site basis. That's to be read alongside the strategic approach to exceptional circumstances set out in the TP addendum, as already discussed today. And Annex 5 also takes into account, I should have mentioned, the contribution of the site towards sustainable patterns of development. So the Annex 5 assessment has been deliberately aligned with broader Greenbelt policy. So we have nothing on 3.10 apart from to say yes for the reasons we've already given.
Can I assume then, for the criticisms that I heard in relation to the methodology as applied to the inner and outer boundaries, those same criticisms apply here, do they? Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Ellsbury?
Thank you, sir. You'll recall that yesterday Mr. Bewley trailered our answer to 3.9, because 3.9 is dealing specifically with Annex 6, and Annex 6 to the addendum to TP1 focuses exclusively on the proposed mods. I want to do no more today than just to highlight again the fact that we have some serious concerns about the justification, such as it is, that sits within Annex 6 for the proposed modification to the boundary on the southern edge of Strensall village. But I'm happy that we can pick that up at the site-specific session, or indeed any village-specific session that you might choose to hold in the new year.
Mrs. Wood? cook.
It's nearly Christmas, sir. And I just really want to flag up that so far as our issues with the council about boundaries are concerned, we take the view that that's really a part 2 matter. And tempting it as it has been at certain points during the day, we hold our fire, therefore, for part 2.
Mr. Grundy.
Thank you. I'm hoping this covers all the points I want to raise to 3.10. But in the first instance, Mr. Linus indicated, well, he seemed to suggest it had been accepted that there are no methodological flaws in respect of Greenbelt release. And I think to which I think it's fair to say that an eyebrow was raised to that. What we say is that if you have estimated the amount of land to be, underestimated the amount of land to be removed, if you have under-provided for development needs beyond the plan period, if you've failed to clearly address the intense needs to address affordability problems and provide a massive uplift to affordable housing, if you've not fully compared Greenbelt releases against one another on a fully comparative basis to identify where least harm will be caused from Greenbelt release, then you have ended up with a process with fundamental, systemic and methodological flaws. These matters relating to Greenbelt release have not been dealt with either robustly or not at all, and as a consequence, the plan is wholly unsound in this respect. Thank you.
Is there anything else before I invite the... Mrs. Hubbard.
It's another piece of administration. I don't know whether you want me to raise it after the council's summed up.
It entirely depends on what it is.
It's back to this missing correspondence from Selby, which I thought was going to be on the website last week.
Oh yeah, you're quite right. Yes, we meant to pick that up, didn't we, and failed to do so.
No, I mentioned this just after lunch, I think, sir. We just want to speak to Selby to check that we've got consent to release the relevant email, and as part of doing that, we know now that we need to speak to Selby about this correspondence that ought to have made its way to you. So we want to wrap that up in speaking with Selby. We'll get that onto the website as soon as we can through those discussions, and then update you as part of our homework list, sir.
In that case, will there be an opportunity to respond to that in writing?
Well, I haven't seen it, so I don't know what it says. Once I have seen it, we'll take a view. There will be an opportunity to comment on it at some point, and we've got further hearings to have yet, so we'll see how that goes. But there will be an opportunity.
And sir, in response to Mr. Grundy, essentially what I was doing was just repeating points that he's accumulated over the course of the day, to which we've responded over the course of the day. We say that the approach to the Greenbelt assessment is sound. The approach to site selection is sound and has been conducted on a properly comparable basis. And the approach to alternatives is sound for the reasons we've given. The methodology for the release of individual sites has been set out in Annex 5 and expressly accords with Greenbelt purposes, as does the review of the inner and outer boundaries, which has been discussed previously. So for all the reasons we've given in response to Mr Grundy's previous submissions, we say that the process followed in this case is sound.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else on matter 3 before I move to closing? Last chance saloon. Okay, very good, thank you.
Sorry, the only thing I was going to mention, would you like to review the homework list before we close, so we understand what's expected of us and we're sure that there's nothing missing?
I was going to come to that.
Right, so, thank you, sir. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, in which case I'm going to move to closing. I'll address that as part of my closing. So first of all, we'd just like to thank everybody who's attended the hearing sessions for the contributions they've made. Well, many of us sitting around the table are, frankly, paid to be here. So we'd like to give our special thanks to local residents and other people who have given up their own time to join in the debate and discussions. I'd like to thank the Council's team for the hard work throughout these Phase 1 hearings, and also to Mrs Crooks for helping to make sure that the Phase 1 hearings has run as smoothly, I think at least, as they possibly could. Mr McCormack and I do, for which we thank you very much, have a great deal to consider and a lot of things to make decisions about, not least of all what the way forward might be. So as a consequence, we aren't able here today to say what that will be, whether there will be further hearings, whether the examination will continue or not, and if it does, precisely what form that will take. We need to think about that amongst other things. I think the general message, though, is that, look, rest assured, we're going to undertake our very best endeavours to move things along one way or the other, as quickly as we can, so that everyone knows where they stand as soon as they possibly can. I don't think, unfortunately, there's anything else that I can say about that at the moment. If we could have from the Council an updated list of proposed main modifications, would be very grateful, and also we'd ask the Council to prepare a homework schedule, which we can then check against our notes, just to make sure that you've got everything and everything's being covered. And as well, it might be helpful just to indicate on that schedule that the likely timescales for getting that to us. I think that's about all I can say, really. Are there any procedural questions before I close? Okay, very.
Sir, no. Apart from, it falls to me to thank you both on behalf of the Council, and thank all other participants at the examination as well. We're very grateful for the way it's been conducted, both by yourselves and the other participants.
Yes, they've been relatively well behaved, haven't they? Okay, unless there are any questions, very good. In which case then, I now formally close the Phase 1 hearing sessions. Thank you all very much, and wish you all a very Merry Christmas.